Good morning. Welcome back to another Teaching Sound Doctrine Bible class. As always, we want to thank you for being here. Want to remind you that the transcripts of every program we do are on our website and our YouTube channel. Our website is jfmiller.com/online class. You can find all of our recordings there, all of our videos and some other material. And you can also find my email address at the top of every transcript. So if you have questions or if you have something that you need to do or want to discuss, then you can contact me and we can go through there. So we've been studying for the last 3 weeks the fear of God. Now, we're talking literal fear, not just in a figurative manner, not just holding God in reverence, not just a superficial fear. We're talking a real serious, hard fear of God. And today, what I would like to do is I would like to take you through a short study of Nehemiah. Now, the story of Nehemiah is that of rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem and following their return from captivity. In this book, we see a people who feared God. Nehemiah described the people to God as those who desire to fear you, your name. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11. Now later in the book, he rebuked some for not walking in the fear of God. If you look at chapter 5 and verse 9, you'll see that. He also cited the fear of God as the cause of his own behavior. Nehemiah chapter 5 verse 15 explains that. See, Nehemiah describes Hanani, who was given charge of the city after the walls were completed, as a faithful man who feared God more than many. Nehemiah chapter 7 and verse 2. Now remember, as we've studied in our earlier lessons, that fear involves 1, awe and respect, and 2, being afraid of displeasing God. Now we're going to see both of these concepts as we look at the book of Nehemiah. Now, with the above references as a backdrop, let's consider what the fear of God would prompt these people to do. Likewise, if we are walking in the fear of God, we will do the same. So now I'm going to make about 14 different points here. And the first point I want to consider is concerned about the things of God. When Nehemiah learned that the walls were torn down and burned, he wept and mourned for many days. He said, I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 4. Nehemiah was so bothered that the city of God was in total ruins that he literally cried. His concern was so great that he couldn't even eat. Now, our concern about spiritual things, the church, a soul in danger, what's being taught, development of an apostasy and our worship, should cause us to be greatly disturbed when we see the things that are not as they should be. Too often, apathy allows the problems to go unchallenged. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 2. Now, the second thing we want to look at is we view God as great and awesome. You see, as Nehemiah prayed, he addressed God as, "Oh, great and awesome God." Nehemiah 1:5. Later, when urging the people to resist their oppression or their opposition, he reminded them that the great and awesome God would fight for them. Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 14. Thirdly, we see the need and act upon it. That's what Nehemiah did. After Nehemiah was informed of the situation in Jerusalem, he went to see for himself. Look at Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. He went out by night and surveyed the damage of the city that it had suffered. And it is interesting here to note what Nehemiah didn't do. He didn't think somebody ought to do something about this. Rather, he immediately made a plea for the people of God to rise up and build. Read chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. His plea included himself in that plan. So when we see the Lord's work or see a need in the Lord's work, someone to be visited or someone to be taught or a problem to be handled or encouragement to be offered, the fear of God will cause us to jump in and do what we can do. Now, that's a problem we face today. We have plenty of people who want to sit and be hearers, but they don't want to be doers. And that's not what Nehemiah was teaching. And the book of Nehemiah teaches that the fear of God is going to cause you to want to go and do something about what's going on and what's wrong. Now, when we see a need in the Lord's work, like I said, someone to visit and all, we need to go do that. It's not just the preacher's responsibility. Now, fourthly, we need diligently work. Chapter 3 of Nehemiah shows who worked and where in the reconstruction of the wall they worked. And in this chapter, we also see the attitude and the manner with which they worked. They diligently repaired the other section that was fallen. Nehemiah chapter 3 and verse 20 shows us this. There is no time for workers who didn't get with it, in other words. Nehemiah chapter 3 and verse 5 states that. Those who fear God will put their whole heart into their work. Now, 5, you got to have a mind to work. The reason they finished the wall in such a short time, 52 days, according to Nehemiah 6 and verse 15, was that the people had a mind to work. Nehemiah 4:6 again backs this up. They were willing to work. They responded to Nehemiah's pleas by saying, "Let us rise up and build." Again, back to chapter 2, verse 18. This is a far cry from those who have to beg and be coached and still not carry out their end of the bargain or their load. Now, number 6, we've got to press on in spite of trouble, in spite of opposition or any kind of fear of man. Sanballat from the north and Tobiah from the south did all they could to hinder the work on the wall. Read Nehemiah chapter 4. They ridiculed their work. They tried to confuse the workers besides planning an attack. However, that didn't stop those who feared God. They returned to their work in verse 15. And while some stood guard with spears in verse 21, they were able to accomplish this mission. They didn't buckle under the pressure. See, we often buckle under pressure. We give in rather than to stand strong. And that's the fear of God will give you that strength to stand strong. They worked long. This is number 7. Work long and hard for the Lord's cause. You see, under Nehemiah's leadership, the people worked on the wall from daybreak until the stars appeared. Nehemiah chapter 4:21 shows you that. They literally worked from sunup to sundown. That would explain their drive, their motivation to give so much to their work. It must be their desire to fear God, as in chapter 1, verse 11. Churches today that have members that fear God will have members who work long and hard for the cause of the Lord. Again, that's something we're lacking today in our churches. Now, number 8, treat one another right. When Nehemiah learned that some of the people were exacting usury or charging unreasonable interest from their brethren, he rebuked them, saying, "What you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God?" Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 9. The fear of God will cause us to treat others fairly and in a right manner. That's the very motive cited by Nehemiah for his own conduct being different from the former governors that you can find in Nehemiah 5:15. Now, number 9, another aspect that we sometimes fail to comprehend is respect for the word. In the 8th chapter, Ezra reads the law before the people. Because of their respect for God or fear, they, listened with the intent of understanding. Verses 2, 3, 7, and 8 show that. And B, they took time for the hearing of the word. Verse 3 and chapter 9, verse 3 teach this. When Ezra opened the book, the people stood, in verse 5. D, they were willing to do what they found lacking in their own lives, verses 13 through 18. And as they listened, they viewed the speaker as a spokesman from God. Read chapter 9, verse 26 through 29. 10, the 10th thing we want to look at here is they made great changes. After reading the law, the people confessed their sins in Nehemiah chapter 9, and the Feast of the Tabernacles was not being observed as the law commanded, so they changed. They also separated themselves from the mixed multitude. If you read chapter 13, verses 1 and 3, you can clearly see that. And after all that, isn't that the purpose of the preaching of God's word? Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 26, verse 29. Those who fear God are going to make any changes necessary, no matter how painful, to fit their lives to the plan of God. Now, 11, we have to recognize that God's wrath, hear me now, God's wrath is just. The confession that is recorded in Nehemiah chapter 9 said to God, "You are just in all that has befallen us, for you have dealt faithfully, but we have done wickedly," according to verse 33. This is a recognition that God's wrath, rebuke, and punishment is fair. Now, 12, it's a promise to be faithful. Once the people confess their sins, they make a covenant that they would walk in God's law and do all the commandments of the Lord. Chapter 10, verse 29 tells us this. Those who fear God make a promise to the Lord by their confession and baptism today that they will serve the Lord faithfully. Those who would think of doing otherwise do not fear God. Now, number 13, The 13th thing that we need to take from this text is exercise righteous indignation. There is such a thing as righteous indignation. There is a time to be upset and a time to be angry. While we must control ourselves properly at all times, there is a time and a place to demonstrate our displeasure over things that do not harmonize with the fear of God. Nehemiah did. While Nehemiah had left Jerusalem to return to the king of can't pronounce it, Eliashib, the priest had compromised with Tobiah, preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 7. Nehemiah said, "It grieved me bitterly before I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room," in verse 8. Later, when Nehemiah learned that some of the people had married people of the land, not their own kind, I guess you would say, he said, "So I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, You shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourself," in Nehemiah chapter 13, 25. That's some pretty bold stuff to be doing. I dare say that we would do that today. But when we fear God, we will be upset when we see God's will being transgressed. That part doesn't change. Even God hates certain things. And we're to hate those things also. Now, lastly, Nehemiah was aware of danger, and we need to be aware of danger. As Nehemiah dealt with the matter of their marriage to the strangers of the land, he cited Solomon as an example of what could happen. He said, "Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin." Read Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 26. If that happened to Solomon, it could and would happen to those in Nehemiah's day. The point is that those who fear God have their eyes open to the danger of things that could lead them away from the Lord. And folks, there's just as many things today, if not more, that will lead you away from God rather than lead you to him and keep you faithful to him. And a good, healthy fear of God allows you to remain strong in that matter. Now, let me just close with one simple sentence. It's my prayer that this study, the three previous studies in this study, will change you or challenge you to do more critical thinking and more study on the concept of the fear of God. Folks, we've just far too often think of the fear of God as simply being reverent to his name and what have you. And we don't really have a fear of what he can do to us and what will happen to us if we are not faithful to him and faithful to the salvation that he gives us. So it takes work. It takes courage. Go back and read the book of Nehemiah. It is just literally filled with great information that you can apply to your life today. It's what the Old Testament's there for. It's there to be an example. And those examples can be applied today. So, friends, I hope that these four studies, the four studies in this series, have brought to your attention the fact that you need to have a good, healthy fear of God. Because if you don't, well, it's like they say, there's only two destinations. There's either heaven or hell. And my friends, I don't want you to be in hell. So I'm begging you, go back and look at how these people feared God and what it caused them to do and how they acted upon the word of God, because we need to be doing that today more than ever. That's the reason our country's in the shape it's in, is simply because we do not fear God. So with all that being said, I will ask you to rewatch the video, download the transcript so that you can study it on your own, and learn to have a good, healthy fear of God. All these lessons are available on our website, jfmiller.com/online class. And all the transcripts and the videos and everything are available there. So I want to thank you for being here with us. And until the next time that we meet, may God bless.